The story I'd like to share with you today is called Zhuangzi Gupen Teng Dadao. It comes from the collection Jingshi Tongyan.
So, what does a title like that even mean? Well, it translates to something like Zhuangzi drums on a basin and attains the great Tao. The name at the start, Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi, belongs to one of China's most influential ancient philosophers. And yes, as the title suggests, his journey toward enlightenment, it involves an earthen basin. It's a very curious story, one that touches on love and death and the nature of reality itself.
The collection it's from, Stories to Caution the World, gives you a little clue about its purpose. See, these aren't just simple tales for entertainment. They're parables, written in the late Ming Dynasty, and they were really designed to make people pause and think a little more deeply about human nature, our desires, and this world we believe we know so well.
And to really understand Zhuangzi's perspective, you have to know about this one question that was at the very core of his philosophy. It's about that blurry line between what's a dream and what's real. And this very question, it sits right at the heart of the strange, and you might even say shocking events of our story.
So, let's begin. Our story opens with Zhuangzi, a brilliant follower of the great sage Laozi. But for Zhuangzi, all the things people chase, fame, wealth, power, they just felt unreal, almost like they were part of a dream. In fact, he often had a dream where he was a butterfly, just drifting from flower to flower, completely unaware that he had ever been a man named Zhuangzi.
But, for all his detachment from the world, Zhuangzi wasn't a hermit. He was a married man. His wife, Tian, was actually his third wife, and the stories say she was a woman of extraordinary beauty, with skin as flawless as ice and snow.
Now, one afternoon, Zhuangzi went for a walk out in the hills near his home. The path he took led him through a cemetery, a quiet, sprawling place filled with burial mounds, like a silent city of the dead stretching out before him. And there, among all the old, weathered tombs, he noticed one that was new. The earth on the mound was still dark and damp, and sitting right beside it was a young woman, dressed in white mourning clothes, and she was furiously fanning the grave with a silk fan, just completely focused on her task.
Well, Zhuangzi was curious, so he walked over and asked her what she was doing. She didn't even stop fanning as she explained. It seems her husband, on his deathbed, had made her promise she couldn't remarry until the dirt on his grave was completely dry. And, well, she was in a bit of a hurry to move on.
Zhuangzi looked at her and at the grave, and he just smiled a little. He offered to help. He took the fan from her, and with a few quiet waves, he used his Taoist arts to channel his energy. And just like that, the damp earth turned pale and dry. The woman was absolutely thrilled. She thanked him, gave him the fan as a gift, and hurried away without so much as a backward glance at the grave.
So Zhuangzi walked home, holding this silk fan, feeling a bit unsettled by the whole thing. When he got back, he found his wife, Tian, and he told her all about the strange woman he'd met in the cemetery.
He held up the fan the widow had given him, and he sighed. He'd even come up with a little verse about it on his way home. He said, "Before death, all speak of deep affection. After death, everyone wants to fan the grave." Well, his wife did not appreciate that. In fact, she became absolutely furious.
She just exploded. "How dare you compare me to that shameless woman," she yelled. "A loyal minister never serves two masters, and a faithful wife would never ever serve two husbands. If you were to die, I would remain faithful for my entire life." And she was so angry, she snatched the fan right out of his hand and tore it into pieces.
And then, just a few days after this argument, Zhuangzi fell gravely ill. His condition worsened very quickly. Finally, lying on his deathbed, he looked up at his weeping wife and whispered, "Now I can finally die in peace, knowing your heart is true." And with that, he took his last breath.
Tian was completely heartbroken. She put on her white mourning robes and just wept day and night. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't sleep. Her grief seemed total, absolute.
But grief is a funny thing. Just 7 days after Zhuangzi's death, a visitor arrived at their door. And by the 20th day, well, everything was about to change.
This visitor, he was a young and incredibly handsome prince from the state of Chu, traveling with his elderly servant. He explained that he'd traveled all this way hoping to study with the great Zhuangzi, only to learn he was too late. But the moment Tian laid eyes on this prince, her heart, which had been so heavy with sorrow, suddenly felt a whole lot lighter.
It took less than 2 weeks for her grief to completely vanish. She sent the old servant to propose marriage to the prince on her behalf. She cast off her white mourning clothes and put on her finest silks. And she had Zhuangzi's coffin moved out of the main hall and put away in an old shed in the back to make room for the wedding feast.
So, the wedding night arrived. The main hall was filled with candles. The prince and Tian were ready to celebrate their new life together just a few yards away from where her old life lay silent in a coffin.
But just as they were about to finalize their marriage, the handsome prince let out a sudden cry. He grabbed his chest, his face contorted in pain, and he collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony.
Tian was frantic. She rushed to his side. The old servant explained that this was an old affliction, a terrible spasm of the heart, and, he said, there was only one cure in the world for it, a cure that was nearly impossible to find.
What was it? The servant explained the only thing that could save the prince's life was the fresh brain of a man who had died no more than 49 days ago, consumed as a medicine.
And of course, there was only one person who fit that description. Without a moment's hesitation, Tian said that her new love for the prince was far more important than any respect for her dead husband. She went and found a heavy wood-splitting axe, and she marched out to the dark shed.
She stood over the coffin, raised the heavy axe, and brought it crashing down. The lid splintered. But as she lifted it to strike again, the coffin lid slowly creaked open from the inside, and someone sat up. It was Zhuangzi. He was alive. And as Tian stood there, frozen in horror, she glanced back at the house and saw the handsome prince and his servant just shimmer and fade away into nothing. They had never been real.
The shame was simply too much for Tian to bear. She took her own silk sash and hanged herself from one of the rafters. Zhuangzi found her body. Quietly and without any ceremony, he placed her inside the very coffin he had just climbed out of. Then he sat on the ground, found an old clay basin, and began to drum on it, softly singing a song to himself.
In his song, it was about how nothing truly lasts. He sang that he was not her husband, and she was not his wife. They were simply two people who had a chance meeting, sharing the same room for a little while before continuing on their separate ways.
After his song, Zhuangzi set fire to the house, burning everything, the coffin, the basin, the whole life he had known there. And he just walked away, finally and truly awake from the dream of this world. And so the story leaves us with a question to ponder. What, in the end, is more real? The passionate promises we make with our words, or the things we do with an axe in our hands?